Continuing on with the Crusades, we have these Crusaders coming back following pretty much the same path that the tribes left from the Anatolian region through Turkey, Constantinople. The Crusades, a complete history, a comprehensive account of a compelling and controversial topic whose bitter legacy resonates to this day. During the last 4 decades, the Crusades have become one of the most dynamic areas of historical inquiry, which points to an increasing curiosity to understand and interpret these extraordinary events. What persuaded people in the Christian West to want to recapture Jerusalem? What impact did the success of the First Crusade in 1099 have on the Muslim, Christian, and Jewish communities of the Eastern Mediterranean? And what was the effect of crusading on the people and institutions of Western Europe? How did the people record the Crusades? And finally, what is their legacy? Academic debate moved forwards significantly during the 1980s as discussion concerning the definition of a crusade gathered real steam. Understanding of the scope of the crusade widened, with a new recognition that crusading extended far beyond the original 11th century expeditions to the Holy Land, both in terms of chronology and scope. That is, they took place long after the end of the Frankish hold on the east and continued down to the 16th century. With regards to their target, crusades were also called against the Muslims of the Iberian Peninsula, the pagan peoples of the Baltic region, the Mongols, political opponents of the papacy, and heretics such as the Cathars and the Hussites. And acceptance of this framework, as well as the centrality of papal authorization for such expeditions, is generally referred to as the pluralist position. The First Crusade was called in November 1095 by Pope Urban at the town of Clermont in France. The Pope made a proposal: whoever for devotion alone, but not to gain honor or money, goes to Jerusalem to liberate the Church of God, can substitute his journey for all penance. This appeal was the combination of a number of contemporary trends along with the inspiration of Urban himself, who added particular innovations to the mix. For several decades, Christians had been pushing back at Muslim lands on the edge of Europe, in the Iberian Peninsula, for example, as well as in Sicily. In some instances, the church had become involved in these events through the offer of limited spiritual rewards for participants. Urban was responsible for the spiritual well-being of his flock, and the crusade presented an opportunity for the sinful knights of Western Europe to cease their endless infighting and exploration of the weak, lay people and churchmen alike, and to make good their violent lives. Urban saw the campaign as a chance for knights to direct their energies towards what was seen as a spiritually meritorious act, namely the recovery of the holy city of Jerusalem from Islam. And I can guarantee you this would have had a lot to do with money being made from trade on the Silk Road. The Muslims had taken Jerusalem in 637. In return for this, they would in effect be forgiven those sins they had confessed. This in turn would have them from the prospect of eternal damnation on the fires of hell, a fate repeatedly emphasized by the church as a consequence of a sinful life. So within an age of such intense religiosity, the city of Jerusalem, as the place where Christ lived, walked and died, held a central role. When the aim of liberating Jerusalem was coupled to lurid, probably exaggerated stories of the maltreatment of both the Levant native Christians and Western pilgrims, the desire for vengeance, along with the opportunity for spiritual advancement, formed a hugely potent combination. Would be looking after his flock and improving the spiritual condition of Western Europe, to the fact that the papacy was engaged in a mighty struggle with the German Emperor Henry IV, the investiture controversy, and that calling the Crusades would enhance the Pope's standing was an opportunity too good for Urban to miss. Now, don't forget of the problems that they had on the Silk Road at this time, and why the Khazarian people converted to Judaism, because the Radahite Jews were able to travel between Asia and between the Christian and Muslim worlds without contest. And this was because the Muslims and the Christians were fighting and were trying to gain control of this trading route. There would have been many remnant Jews still left in this region from the fall of Jerusalem at the time after the Romans, just living their lives. And there was also the new converts to the religion of Islam. It says here, a spark to this dry tinder came from another Christian force, the Byzantine Empire. Emperor Alexios I feared the advance of the Seleucid Turks towards his capital city of Constantinople. Well, as history proves, he had a right to be fearful. The Byzantines were Greek Orthodox Christians, but since 1054 had been in a state of schism with the Catholic Church. The launch of the Crusade presented Urban with a chance to move closer to the Orthodox and to heal the rift. So I just want to stop there for a moment, and I'm going to read the verse from Revelation 13:15. And it said, "And he had power to give life unto the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause that as many as should not worship the image of the beast should be killed." Now, I just want to make a point here about the Crusaders. So if the Crusaders are the first beast, and to crusade means crusade, each of a series of medieval military expeditions, a vigorous campaign for political, social, and religious change. So that's what the meaning of crusade is. Now, the meaning of jihad means a struggle or fight against enemies of Islam, the spiritual struggle with oneself against sin. It's from Arabic jihad, literally effort, expressing in Muslim thought struggle on behalf of God and Islam. Now, isn't this almost the same word as crusade? Isn't this what the Crusaders were being told they were doing in the name of, they were going and making an effort to struggle against the enemies of God and the enemies of themselves and the Christian world, according to the Pope. So jihad is an Arabic word which literally means striving or struggling, especially with praiseworthy aim. In an Islamic context, it can refer to almost any effort to make personal and social life conform with God's guidance, such as struggles against one's evil inclinations or efforts towards the moral betterment of the Muslim community. I think crusade and jihad are practically the same movement under a different supposed religion. Now, is it possible that these two beasts are an image to themselves? The false prophet makes an image to the first beast and forces everybody to worship that image. It was traditional that when a new sultan came to power, he would immediately attempt to launch new wars because he would be noted in Islamic history as how well he fought against the kafir. On historynet.com, it states jihad, war to the knife. From its origins as an Islamic political and religious tool, jihad has morphed into all-out war against non-Muslims. I just want to add here, while we're at it, the definition of Zionism. So this is according to the Encyclopedia Britannica. It says Zionism, Jewish nationalist movement that has had as its goal the creation and support of a Jewish national state in Palestine, the ancient homeland of the Jews. So isn't this what the Crusaders were doing, establishing a Roman Catholic capital of Jerusalem, Kingdom of Israel? Isn't this what the jihadists were doing, establishing their rulership over the dome in the rock? Zionism, a movement for originally the re-establishment and now the development and protection of a Jewish nation in what is now Israel. It was established as a political organization in 1897 under Theodor Herzl and was later led by Chaim Weizmann. Isn't Zionism just another form of holy war? The doctrine of jihad or holy war was Muhammad's principal military legacy. It is indisputable that divinely justified warfare became a force of major importance during the early Islamic period as a significant motivator for the Muslim conquest that followed Muhammad's death in 632 and remains a primary characteristic of Islamic warfare. Pre-Islamic Arabia knew no notion of ideology of any sort, and certainly no notion of religiously sanctioned war. Pre-Islamic Arab warfare was directly linked to the economic and social circumstances of pasturage, material wealth, and prestige, and was characterized by looting, raiding, and clan and tribal blood feuds. The idea of warfare as Allah's command, rewarded by martyrdom and swift transport to paradise, was an innovation with no precedent in Arab culture, custom, or practice, brought about entirely by Muhammad's thinking and influence on events. Setting aside the question of divine influence on Muhammad's thinking, where might he have acquired his idea of holy war and martyrdom? He was born circa 570 in Mecca, so this is after the establishment of Constantine's Holy Roman Empire and after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Muhammad lost both parents in childhood and lived with various relatives. In his teens, he became a caravanner traveling to Jewish communities in Arabia and Christian border communities of the Byzantine Empire. Among the Jews, he may have encountered the concept of harem, holy war against idolaters and non-believers. Now, if he was traveling with Jewish caravanners, they were more than likely Edomite, converted Jews, Radahite Jews who were traveling the Silk Road, who had learnt the trade of the Silk Road before they converted to Judaism. Go back and watch my video on the Kingdom of Edom before they were converted and how they took control of this King's Spice Road while Judah was in captivity in Babylon. It says the influence of Greek philosophy, Roman occupation, and the Jewish diaspora put a dampener on the Jewish concept of holy war, while the Christian ideal of martyrdom faded under the impact of nationalism. The rise of the nation-state, enlightenment, religious freedom, and the Industrial Revolution, forces that have shaped Western culture. These forces had little impact in the Islamic world, however, with the consequence that the Muslim idea of holy war has remained essentially unchanged from the time of Muhammad. In addition, martyrdom by death in battle while defending the faith of proselytism became a central tenet of Islam. Martyrs went directly to paradise without having to suffer the torment of the grave, unlike other Muslims who had to wait until Judgment Day to be resurrected. So did Muhammad get his idea of holy war from these traders he was accompanying on these trade routes? More than likely Silk Spice Road. The concept of Crusades was developed in the 11th century as a result of organized Christian forces fighting Muslims in Sicily and Spain. The best known Crusades were a series of military expeditions prompted by the papacy during the Middle Ages aimed at taking the Holy Land for Christendom. The Holy Land had been in the hands of the Muslims since 638, and it was against them that the Crusades were at least nominally directed. Desire for adventure, conquest, and plunder seem to have been at least as influential in attracting Christians to the cause as any desire to restore Christ's supposed patrimony. Now, I'd just like to make a comment here that this is in the name of Christendom. It was never a Christian thing to go and reclaim the Holy Land. It was a Roman Catholic thing. And why did they want to reclaim the Holy Land? And I believe that's because the Roman Catholic Church was the re-establishment of the temple system that was in Jerusalem. They've always wanted this land back. They've tried in these crusades. I believe the First and Second World Wars are just a neo-crusade. Their attempts to gain this city of Jerusalem. And we see that in this period of the Crusades, they gained it and they called it the Kingdom of Jerusalem. It was a combined empire of the church, the whore, and the beast, and the kings who gave their crowns over to this beast to rule these regions. The church, which quite possibly could have been started by Simon Magus and was run by this Babylonian system, mystery religion system that had crept into Israel, or to the southern kingdom of Israel, from Babylon and Persia, and from the Edomite converts to Judaism. This Roman Catholic Church is not Christian. It never was. They've just claimed the early church apostles as their own to give weight to their story. But they knew that they could rule the known world at the time through control of Christians rather than the slaughter or the martyrdom of Christians. We know that Constantine quite possibly was related to the Herod family. He was Roman nobility. Roman nobility married into the Herod family. There's no denying that. It appears that they are related. So the dragon gives this beast the power, the dragon families who rule, the Whore Church who come from Jerusalem and established the Roman Catholic Church, and the kings of the lost 10 tribes give their crowns and their power and their horn to the beast. Now, I want to do more investigating into this about the church rather than just stating it. It is my belief, but at the moment, there's a lot of information to research here, so I'm just going to go into who the Crusaders killed. And we look at who the Crusaders were. We were told they were French. They were also a German contingent in the Rhine Valley. Was granted a further sign from God when he sent them an enchanted goose to follow. So we have Germans. Says here, it led them to the Jewish neighborhood of Speyer, where they took the divine hint and massacred the inhabitants. Similar massacres followed at Worms, Mainz, Metz, Prague, Ratisbon, and other cities. The pilgrims completed. Peter the Hermit's army marched through Hungary towards Turkey. On the way, they killed 4,000 Christians in Zemun, present-day Semlin, pillaged Belgrade, and set fire to towns around Nice. They thieved and murdered all the way to Constantinople, by which time only about a third of the initial force remained. The emperor was astonished. He had asked for trained mercenaries, but what arrived was a murderous rabble. To minimize the risks of danger to his own city, he allowed the Crusaders to proceed without entering the city. Once across the Bosphorus, they continued as before, marching through Nicaea. A French contingent ravaged the countryside. They looted property and robbed, tortured, raped and murdered, and mainly Christian inhabitants of the country. So these would have been people, Christians, who had probably converted from the apostles, and their families would have been descendants of the people who the apostles had converted. This was a Christian persecution. It was a tribulation. And it's the tribulation spoken about in Revelation and the wrath of God's great winepress. They looted property, robbed, murdered the mainly Christian inhabitants of the country, reportedly roasting babies on spits. Some 6,000 German crusaders, including bishops and priests, jealous of the French success, tried to emulate it. However, this time the army of Turks arrived and chopped the Holy Crusaders to pieces. Survivors were given the chance to save their lives by converting to Islam, which some did, including their leader Reynold, setting a precedent for many future crusades. The principal expedition that followed was more organized, although Crusaders continued to threaten their Christian allies in Constantinople on the way. The Christian emperor was shocked to find his capital under attack by Western Christians in Holy Week. He developed a technique bringing the barbarian Westerners under control by speedily processing batches of them as they arrived. His technique was to induce them to swear fealty to him, then swiftly move them across the Bosphorus before the next batch arrived. On the far side of the water, their massed forces were no threat to the city. Apart from further devastating the countryside, they could do little but prepare for their first encounter with their non-Christian enemies. So they murdered Christians, they murdered Jews. It says here, when the Crusaders captured Jerusalem on the 14th of July 1099, they massacred the inhabitants, Jews and Muslims alike, men, women and children. Killing continued all night and into the next day. Jews who took refuge in the synagogue were burned alive. Muslims sought refuge in the Al-Aqsa Mosque under the protection of the Christian banner. In the morning, Crusaders forced an entry and massacred them all. 70,000, according to the Arab historian, including a large number of scholars, as one churchman explained. It says here, but now that our men had possession of the walls and towers, wonderful sights were to be seen. Some of our men, and this was more merciful, cut off the heads of their enemies. Others shot them with arrows so that they fell from their towers. Others tortured them longer by casting them into the flames. Piles of heads, hands, and feet were to be seen in the streets of the city. It was necessary to pick one's way over the bodies of men and horses, but these were small matters compared to what happened at the Temple of Solomon, a place where religious services are ordinarily chanted. What happened there? If I tell the truth, it will exceed your powers of belief. So let it suffice to say that much, at least that in the Temple of the Porch of Solomon, men rode in blood up to their knees and bridle reins. Indeed, it was just and splendid judgment of God that this place should be filled with the blood of the unbelievers, since it had suffered so long from their blasphemies. The city was filled with corpses and blood. Now if we go to Revelation, in Revelation 14, the 144,000 are sealed, and this is the end of the first feast of Revelation. In Revelation 13, it describes the beast coming out of the sea, the beast coming out of the earth, which I'll go back to. And that's the beginning of the second feast of atonement. We have the 144,000 sealed. It says, and then I looked, and there before me was a lamb standing on Mount Zion, and him with the 144,000 who had his name and his father's name written on their foreheads. And I heard a sound from heaven like the roar of rushing waters and the loud peal of thunder. The sound I heard was like that of harpists playing their harp, and they sang a new song before the throne and before the four living creatures and the elders. No one could learn the song except the 144,000 who had been redeemed from the earth. Now remember that when Israel was, especially the southern kingdom, was the last one to be cast to the earth, now these people are redeemed from the earth, the inhabitants of the earth, the tribes and the people of Israel are now among the earth with the Assyrian and the Egyptian. These are those who did not defile themselves with women, for they remain virgins. They did not defile themselves with the whore churches. They follow the Lamb wherever he goes. They were purchased from among mankind and offered the first fruits of God and the Lamb. No lie was found in their mouths. They are blameless. So they are the wheat and barley wave offering, the first fruits, the first of who rose in Matthew 27 with Jesus. The three angels. Then I saw another angel flying in midair, and he had the eternal gospel to proclaim to those who live on the earth. So now they're preaching to the earth. People, everybody's the earth now. To every nation, tribe, language, and people, he said in a loud voice, fear God and give him glory, because the hour of judgment has come. Worship him who made the heavens and the earth and the sea and the springs of water. The second angel followed and said, fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, which made all the nations drink the maddening wine of her adulteries. A third angel followed them and said in a loud voice, if anyone worships the beast and its image and receives its mark on their forehead or in their hand, they too will drink the wine of God's fury, which has been poured full strength into the cup of his wrath. They will be tormented with burning sulfur in the presence of the holy angels and of the Lamb, and the smoke of their torment will rise forever and ever. There will be no rest, day or night, for those who worship the beast and its image, or anyone who receives the mark of its name. This calls for patient endurance on the part of the people of God who keep his commandments and remain faithful to Jesus. Then I heard a voice from heaven say, "Write this, blessed are the dead who die in the Lord from now on. Yes, says the Spirit, they will rest in their labor, for their deeds will follow them. And the harvesting of the earth and trampling of the winepress." So here we have the Feast of Atonement. "I looked, and there before me was a white cloud, and seated on the cloud was one like the Son of Man, with a crown of gold on his head and a sharp sickle in his hand. Then another angel came out of the temple and called in a loud voice to him who was sitting on the cloud, 'Take your sickle and reap, because the time to reap has come, for the harvest of earth is ripe.' So he who was seated on the cloud swung his sickle over the earth, and the earth was harvested. Another angel came out of the temple in heaven, and he too had a sharp sickle. Still another angel who had charge of the fire came from the altar and called in a loud voice to him who had the sharp sickle, 'Take your sharp sickle and gather the clusters of grapes from the earth's vine, because its grapes are ripe.' So this is, harm not the oil and wine. Now the wine is being trampled. The angel swung his sickle on the earth, gathered his grapes, and threw them into the great winepress of God's wrath. They are trampled in the winepress outside the city. The blood flowed of the press, rising as high as the horses' bridles for a distance of 1,600 stadia." I just want to add here how it says that the blood flowed outside the city. If this blood flowed in the temple, it tells us here that it's where the ancient city of David was located, which is outside the city wall today. As shown in the last video about the city of David and the old temple, it says this is an aerial view of the modern location of the city of David, looking from south to north. The white broken line is where the ancient city of David was located, which is outside the city wall today. The gold domed building is the museum shrine called the Dome of the Rock. It is surrounded by ancient retaining wall of the Herodian Temple Mount, which gives distance perspective. So I'm just actually wondering whether the Temple of Herod was even built where the Temple of Solomon was built. You know, like, if this is Herod's Temple Mount, Herod built his temple. I know it was built supposedly on top of the second temple that was built after the captivity in Persia, when King Cyrus sent them back and allowed them to rebuild the temple. So this area here, as we stated in the last video, where this road is going through near this wall in the center, where Herod's Temple Mount is where they say the Temple of Solomon was built, and not where the Dome of the Rock is, which is outside of today's city walls. And I'm wondering whether it was outside of the city walls in John's day as well. What did they say in the Crusade? This is a Crusader talking here. "So let it suffice to say this much, at least, that in the temple, the porch of Solomon, men rode in blood up to their knees and bridle reins. Indeed, it was a just and splendid judgment of God that this place should be filled with the blood of unbelievers, since it had suffered so long from their blasphemies. The city was filled with corpses and blood." So it's saying here that 1,600 stadia was about 200 Roman miles, but it works out to 183.93 modern miles. Now it's saying that it flowed for a distance of that up to the horses' bridles, but I've seen other interpretations meaning a stadia or a stadium. Let's have a look at the Strong's Concordance. So according to the Strong's Concordance, the word is 4712 stadion, a stadium, a race course. Noun, masculine noun, stadion. A stadium, by implication, a race course. A stadium, 1/8 of a Roman mile, a race course for public games. So it's probably the distance of a race course, a furlong is what the word says in the King James Version. The measure length of an ancient foot race, a furlong, total length, distance. So what it's saying here is that it's up to a stadium. It's a great amount of blood, a massive amount of blood and death, and it's quite shocking, really. It says, even before the killing was over, the Crusaders went to Church of the Holy Sepulchre, rejoicing and weeping for joy to thank God for his assistance. Neither was this an isolated incident. It was wholly typical. When the Crusaders took Caesarea in 1101, many citizens fled to the great mosque and begged the Christians for mercy. At the end of the butchery, the floor was a lake of blood. The whole city, only a few girls and infants survived soon afterwards. There was a similar massacre in Beirut. Such barbarity shocked the Eastern world and left an impression of the Christian West that was still not being forgotten in the third millennium. So, I mean, if you look at the 1/600 stadia, it's showing a great distance where there's just countless amounts of blood spilt on these people living in the region who were, as I said, leftover remnants of the people of Judea, and they had converted to Islam or Christianity, or they were still practicing the Jewish faith, the Southern Kingdom Jewish faith, I should say. What was the remnant of the Hebrew faith? And it just goes on and on with these crusades. But if we look in Revelation again, so this is the harvest. So we're saying that this is God's vengeance in some ways, even though the Crusaders were quite evil in what they've done. Just as the Romans took Jerusalem, the Crusaders came in and destroyed what was left of this region. And then we have the 7 angels with the 7 plagues. I saw in heaven another great and marvelous sign, 7 angels with 7 last plagues, last because with them God's wrath is completed. I saw what looked like a sea of glass glowing with fire, and standing beside the seat those who had been victorious over the beast and its image and over the number of its name. They held harps given them by God and sang the song of God's servant Moses and the Lamb. Great and marvelous are your deeds, Lord God Almighty, just and true are your ways. King of the nations, who will not fear you, Lord, and bring glory to your name. For you alone are holy. All nations will come and worship before you, for your righteous acts have been revealed. If there are any hopes of the Pharisaical Sanhedrin to rebuild the temple at this time, all hopes were lost after the Crusades and the takeover of Jerusalem by the Ottoman Empire. After this, I looked and I saw in heaven the temple that is the tabernacle of the covenant law, and it was opened. Out of the temple came the 7 angels with the 7 plagues. They were dressed in clean, shining linen and wore golden sashes around their chests. One of the 4 living creatures gave to the 7 angels 7 golden bowls or vials filled with the wrath of God, who lives forever and ever. And the temple was filled with smoke from the glory of God and from his power, and no one could enter the temple until the 7 plagues of the 7 angels were completed. So the 7 bowls of God's wrath. Then I heard a loud voice from the temple saying to the 7 angels, go pour out the 7 bowls of God's wrath on the earth. First angel went and poured out his bowl on the land, and ugly festering sores broke out on the people who had the mark of the beast and worshipped his image. Now, what's really interesting when we look at historically what caused the Black Death, similar to the Silk Road warfare in the Middle Ages, helped contribute to the spread of the Black Plague. For example, the Crusades occurred in the centuries leading up to the start of the Black Death and set the stage for increased interaction between Europe and the Middle Eastern civilizations. The Crusades, which began in the 11th century, were the series of missions carried out by Christian crusaders from Europe to recapture the Holy Land in the Middle East, which was controlled by Muslims. Ultimately, the Crusades caused an exchange of people between Europe and Asia, which allowed for the easier transport of plague and infected rats, if we believe that's where it came from. This is just the official view. The death tolls of the Black Death were massive, with as much as 50% of the population dying due to plague. Several factors contributed to spread of the plague and all over Black Death. First, hygiene played a crucial role in the spread of the disease. Europe in the Middle Ages lacked the modern conveniences of sanitization and running water. So here's one. It says another common belief about the plague was that it was spread by certain ethnic groups. For example, immigrant groups of Jewish people were often blamed for the spread of the disease and were persecuted as a result. Next, some believed that the plague was a result of God's will and was punishment for the actions of people. As such, many people turned to their faith during the crisis. Now, if Jewish people were getting blamed for this, it was probably a reason for that, and that was probably given the fact that a lot of them were traders on the Silk Road, and the Silk Road was the initial blame for the cause of the Black Death. It says here, the Black Death is in the term that historians use to describe the spread of the bubonic plague. It was one of the most significant events of the Middle Ages and had profound impact on life for people of the time. In studying the history and significance of the Black Death, historians have identified several key causes, including rats, trade networks such as the Silk Road, warfare such as the Crusades, poor hygiene, and lack of medical understanding. So these Jewish people were probably getting blamed for that reason, that they were bringing it from the Silk Road routes into Europe. Also, the Crusaders would have been bringing it back as well. In all, the Black Death was an important event that fundamentally changed life for people across Europe and Asia. It was caused by the spread of the bubonic plague and caused massive death tolls. However it occurred, it is remembered today as one of the most important pandemics in all of human history, and for its role in other major events and time periods, such as the Silk Road, the Middle Ages, and the Renaissance. So with a quick Google, we have the symptoms of the Black Plague, which were fever and chills, headache, muscle pain, general weakness, seizure. Septicemic plague, Black Death, or Black Plague symptoms and signs include fever, weakness, abdominal pain, chills, and shock. Tissue bleeding and death may cause the dying tissue to appear black. The signs and symptoms of plague generally develop between 2 and 7 days after a person acquires the infection. Symptoms and signs depend on the type of plague and including the following. Bubonic plague symptoms as sign include painful and enlarged or swollen lymph nodes. An enlarged lymph node due to the plague is called a bubo. Chills, headache, fever, fatigue, weakness. Septicemic plague, Black Death, or Black Plague symptoms and signs include fever, weakness, abdominal pain, chills, and shock. Tissue bleeding and death may cause the dying tissue to appear black. And pneumonic plague symptoms and signs include characteristics of pneumonia symptoms like chest pain, shortness of breath, cough, fever, chills, nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. So I believe it was the one that gave us the sores. If we go back to Revelation, it says, the first angel went and poured out his bowl in the land, and an ugly festering sore broke out on the people who had the mark of the beast and worshipped its image. Now the festering sores were on the lymph nodes. They were black. It was blood building up. I'll see if I can get an image of something. So here we have fever, swelling on lymph glands, buboes in the lymph area, red spots on skin that later turned black, hence the name Black Death. So what does the Bible say? It says festering sores that broke out. Second angel poured out his bowl in the sea, and it turned to blood like that of a dead person, and every living thing in the sea died. A third angel poured out his bowl on the rivers and the springs of the water, and they became blood. Now, I'm not going to look them up. There may be some obscure history showing that this may have happened, or it's been hidden in some Vatican basement somewhere. Fourth angel poured out his bowl on the sun, and the sun was allowed to scorch people with fire. They were seared. By the intense heat, they cursed the name of God who had control over these plagues, but they refused to repent and glorify him. So I may go back later and find, if I can find any information regarding these other bowls and judgments, see if I can find any information on them. It says the fifth angel poured out his bowl on the throne of the beast, and the kingdom was plunged into darkness. People gnawed their tongues in agony and cursed the God of heaven because of their pain and their sores, but they refused to repent of what they had done. if this has happened in history, it's going to be hard to find. I'm going to try to find it. And also, this could have been an electromagnetic event with the sun, some kind of, maybe the sun gave out a huge CME, which burned people. And a lot of the times this sort of stuff was recorded in the Chinese records. They have a very old record that goes back a long time. And I'm sure as does the Western records, but a lot of our records have been hidden from us. They say it was the Dark Ages and people were illiterate, so they didn't record things going back like the Chinese recorded historical events. It's really interesting that they could record historical events with a lot of accuracy going back before Christ's time, even during the Roman Empire, and yet all of a sudden during this dark age nobody could read or write or record history. Fifth angel poured out his bowl on the throne of the beast, and the kingdom was plunged into darkness. People gnawed their tongues in agony and cursed the God of heaven. So if the bowl was poured out on the beast and there was darkness, I know there's stories in history of the year where there was no summer. So this was in 1816, but I've heard of other years earlier on. It says the year without a summer was a bizarre weather disaster in 1816. A particular 19th century disaster played out during the 1816 when the weather in Europe and North America took a bizarre turn that resulted in widespread crop failure and even famine. So there's another one here. This is from the Time magazine. The medieval volcanic eruption that triggered a year without summer. Ancient chronicles told of an unusually cold summer in the year of 1258. Now researchers have found the volcanic eruption that temporarily changed the planet's climate. It was known as the year without a summer. In the medieval chronicles of Europe, the summer of 1258 was described as unseasonably cold, resulting in poor harvests that were devastated by heavy floods. The summer, thousands of people were buried in mass graves in London, possibly a result of the bad weather and the lack of food. Think Game of Thrones with its winter that lasts for a year. The reason behind the cold summer was the massive explosion of a volcano that would have thrown up as much as 10 cubic miles of rock and dust, creating a plume that would have reached as high as 25 miles above the ground. A dust plume that large would have had global effects, blocking out sunlight and exerting a dramatic cooling effect on the planet, leading to the year without summer. A similar effect was seen after 1991 eruption of Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines, which reduced the amount of sunlight reaching the Earth by 10% and a temporary drop of 0.7 Fahrenheit in global average temperatures. But Pinatubo threw up perhaps 2.4 cubic miles of rock. The medieval volcano eruption was much, much greater. Now we know that volcanoes are linked to the sun and the sun cycles, and so perhaps we had a solar cycle. Perhaps there was a CME, like the CME that hit Quebec, Canada a few years back. And perhaps this CME hit the region of the Holy Land in Europe. Perhaps this burnt people, who knows? This could account for the melted stone buildings, or what looks like melted stone in the Anatolian region. So solar flares and coronal mass ejection. A solar flare isn't just an explosion of hot gases, it pushes out waves of light all across the spectrum. That includes light we can't see, including radiation in the form of X-rays and gamma rays. These rays can be dangerous to humans. Fortunately, the Earth's atmosphere absorbs most of these high-energy rays. That's not to say everyone is in the clear after a solar flare. Humans in space or at high altitude on board an aeroplane, for example, could risk exposure to intense radiation. Short-term damage could include skin irritation. Long-term consequences might include an increased risk of developing skin cancer, but it's likely that any affected human would eventually recover from the exposure. So if we had a big enough CME and for some reason the Earth's Van Allen belts are not working, then as they are at the moment, they're weak. If they've been weakened, in these solar cycles, then there's no reason to doubt that a very large CME could burn and irritate people's skin. So I'm a believer in the electric sun theory. The electric sun theory, or electric sun model, and electric sun hypothesis is the idea that the sun and stars derives the main source of its power electrically from its surroundings rather than from within by nuclear fusion, which is the mainstream view. The electric sun model is part of the electric universe theory and is being scientifically tested by the Sapphire Project. Now, I know this is a NASA website and I'm going to cop flack for this, but we can find this article anywhere because people live through this. The day the sun brought darkness, and this is on March 13, 1989, the entire province of Quebec, Canada, suffered an electrical power blackout. Hundreds of blackouts occur in some part of North America every year. The Quebec blackout was different because this one was caused by a solar storm. On February March 10, 1989, astronomers witnessed a powerful explosion of the sun. Within minutes, the solar flare that accompanied the outburst immediately caused shortwave radio interference, including the jamming of radio signals from Radio Free Europe into Russia. It was thought that the signals had been jammed by the Kremlin, but it was only the sun acting up. So what we do know here to be true is that the sun released a CME and that the CME hit mainly Quebec and blocked out a lot of radio signals. Solar flares can cause numerous problems on Earth, such as interfering with shortwave radios that are being used, emitting more rays, allowing people to get more of the sunburn during this time frame. However, most interesting effects is on the climate. The sun rays can penetrate the ozone layer in some cases. So the Carrington event was the most intense geomagnetic storm in recorded history, peaking from the 1st to the 2nd of September 1859 during solar cycle 10. It created strong auroral displays that were reported globally and caused sparking and even fires in multiple telegraph stations. The geomagnetic storm was most likely the result of a coronal mass ejection from the sun colliding with Earth's magnetosphere. The geomagnetic storm was associated with very bright solar flare on the 1st of September 1859. It was observed and recorded independently by British astronomers Richard Carrington and Richard Hodgson. So the Carrington event took place a few months before the solar maximum, a period of elevated solar activity in solar cycle 10. So the geomagnetic storm is thought to have been initiated by a major coronal mass ejection, CME, that travelled directly towards Earth. Typical CMEs take several days to arrive at Earth, but it is believed that the relatively high speed of this CME was made possible by a prior CME, perhaps the cause of the large aurora event on the 29th of August that cleared the way of ambient solar wind plasma for the Carrington event. Now, I do believe in the electric sun. So, however far away from Earth it is or however big it is, I'm not sure. I haven't been there, so I can't tell you. Worldwide reports of the effects of the geomagnetic storm of 1859 were compiled and published by American mathematician Elias Loomis, which support the observations of Carrington and Stewart. Auroras were seen around the world, those in the northern hemisphere as far as south as the Caribbean. Wow, that's really far south. The aurora over the Rocky Mountains in the US were so bright that the glow woke gold miners who began preparing breakfast because they thought it was morning. People in the northeast United States could read a newspaper by aurora's light. The aurora was visible from the poles to low latitude areas such as South Central Mexico, Queensland, Cuba, Hawaii, southern Japan and China, and even at low latitudes very close to the equator such as in Colombia. So telegraph systems all over Europe and North America failed, in some cases giving telegraph operators electric shocks. Telegraph pylons threw sparks. Some telegraph operators could continue to send and receive messages despite having disconnected their power supplies. Some telegraph lines seem to have been able to produce a sufficient geomagnetically induced current from the electromagnetic field to allow for continued communication with the telegraph operator power supply switched off. The following conversation occurred between two operators of the American telegraph line between Boston and Portland, Maine, on the night of the 2nd of September, 1859, and reported in the Boston Traveler. So, Boston operator to Portland operator, please cut off your battery power source entirely for 15 minutes. Portland operator will do so. It is now disconnected. Mine is disconnected and we are working with the auroral current. How do you receive my writing? Better than with our batteries on. Current comes and goes gradually. My current is very strong at times and we can work better without the batteries, as the aurora seems to neutralize and augment our batteries alternately, making currents too strong at times for our relay magnets. Suppose we work with our batteries while we are affected by this trouble. Portland, yes, very well. Shall I go ahead with the business? Yes, go ahead. The conversation was carried on for around 2 hours using no battery power at all and working solely with the current induced by the aurora. And it was said that this was the first time on record that more than a word or two was transmitted in such a manner. So if for the Tartarian truthers out there and the mud flooders, you know, these ancient technologies, perhaps the magnetosphere was in a different phase back in those days, and that it was far easier to use the electricity in the atmosphere. I mean, this is proof that if we have a greater current in the atmosphere, that these electrical devices will just run. So solar flares are a solar storm. These are small disruptions in the atmosphere of the sun that erupt. A sunspot on the sun is actually a storm in progress. It is the equivalent of seeing a storm on Earth from space. It simply looks like a cloud roaring over the environment. Solar flares can cause numerous problems on Earth, such as interfering with shortwave radio that are being used, emitting more rays, allowing people to get more of a sunburn during this time frame. So how much more of a sunburn can they get? I'm wondering. I guess it depends on how big the solar flare is. So if these people were being scorched with the sun, is it possible that during this time we had a solar flare? Something went on with the sun? Revelation tells us that the fourth angel poured his bowl out in the sun. The sun was allowed to scorch people with fire. They were seared by the intense heat and they cursed the name of God. So how do we know that this didn't happen back in these days? If there was a solar event happening or some astronomical event, it could have caused the water to become blood, caused the third of the sea to die. The fifth angel poured out his bowl on the throne of the beast and the kingdom was plunged into darkness. So perhaps the sun temporarily went dark after this solar event. So there's a story about the Chinese fleet in New Zealand. It says the destruction of Zhao Man and Hong Bao's fleet in the Southern Ocean by a tsunami triggered by a comet. In the book 1421, I contend that the Emperor Zhu Di had sent fleets to the Southern Ocean to determine the precise position of the star Canopus. The Chinese needed this information to establish accurate latitudes and longitudes in the southern hemisphere. There were many great voyages. Fleets were continuously at sea from 1403 to 1432, and the scale of the losses was even more horrific. More than 900 ships never returned. This is exemplified in the Southern Oceans. The discovery of Zheng, his record shows that 4 separate fleets charted the Atlantic, not the 2 I have claimed. Some got further south, deep into the Weddell Sea. This memo describes a catastrophe which overtook the fleet which had sailed south of New Zealand down to Campbell Island in Auckland and Auckland Island. A huge comet struck the ocean less than 100 miles from the fleets, incinerating many ships and hurling the blazing wrecks into New Zealand South Island and the east coast of Australia and across the Pacific and Indian Oceans. Apparently this is documented in Chinese history, and there's a documentary on YouTube which is really fascinating, and I'll show the links for that later. And they've actually found Chinese boats on the coast of New Zealand, and there's evidence to show of a tsunami which hit the east coast of Australia. So how this information came to light is an interesting story in itself. A retired marine engineer, a surveyor, Cedric Bell, read my book at a time when he had already decided to visit New Zealand's South Island to see his son Dave and his daughter-in-law and grandchildren. Whilst there, Cedric decided to survey the southeast coast of the South Island. To his amazement, magnetic anomaly surveys showed that 44 large ships were either buried in the sand or inland. Cedric sent a 130-page report to the company, who were then making a television documentary about my book. And this is from the Gavin Menzies webpage. Obviously, he's written a book about this. And in this documentary, there was a report from a man who, as a child, had played on a beach in the South Island of New Zealand and had actually come across one of these boats in the sand and had found many Chinese plates in the boat, and had played with these items, and eventually it was covered over by sand and disappeared. So it says the comet appears 26 times as bright as the sun. Its screaming noise of 100 decibel blows out of the eardrums of the sailors. They received horrific burns. The comet hits the water about 60 miles south of the combined fleets before the gigantic wave, more than 700 foot high, tossed the ships aside down the like matchsticks. The masts, the rig and rigging have caught fire, fanned by 400 miles per hour winds. Here is the extract which Dallas H. Abbott, Andrew Matson, and Stephen F. Peaker of Lamont Dorothy Earth Laboratory, Palisades, New York, and Edward A. Bryant, Faculty of Science, University of Wollongong, Australia, submitted to the meeting of Geological Society of America in the fall 2003. Goff attributes coastal abandonment in New Zealand at 1500 AD to an earthquake-induced tsunami event. However, the largest historical earthquakes produce maximum tsunamis up to 40 to 60 meters. On Stewart Island, New Zealand, see diagram 3, beach sand is present around 220 meters above sea level at Hellfire Hut and around 150 meters above sea level at Mason Bay in eastern Australia. There are mega tsunami deposits with maximum run-ups of over 130 meters and a carbon-14 age of about 1500 AD. Mega tsunami deposits occur on the eastern side of Lord Howe Island in the middle of the Tasman Sea, implying a source crater for the tsunamis further east. We name this source crater Mahuika for the Maori god of fire. Mahuika crater is 20 plus 2 kilometers wide and at least 153 meters deep. It is on the New Zealand continental shelf at 48.3 degrees south, 48 degrees 18 south, and 166.4 degrees east. Several pieces of evidence point to Mahuika as the source crater for the 1500 AD event. The first is that the crater lies on a great circle path from Australia oriented at about 45-degree angle to the general trend of the eastern Australian coast. Mega tsunami deposits near Wollongong and Jervis Bay, Australia, suggest a tsunami wave orientated at this angle to the coast. The second is the sub-bottom depth of the impact deposit. We have found impact ejecta in all the dredges near the crater because marine sediments are deposited at a rate of about 1 centimeter per 1,000 years. This is expected of an impact deposit only 500 years old, and we are seeking carbon-14 dates to confirm this. There is the distribution of the tektites, which are found on the opposite side of the crater from the direction of impact or arrival. Although we found impact ejecta in many samples, only some samples contain tektites. All tektites being samples are located southeast of the crater in the opposite direction from southeast Australia, where the impact fireball was seen by Aborigines. In more recent correspondence, the Lamont Dorothy team has narrowed the dating to 1430 to 1443. So the impact fireball was seen more than 1,000 miles away. So the heat and flash, 26 times brighter than the sun, would have blinded most of the crew before setting their skin on fire. The tsunami was more than 220 meters, 700 feet high when it reached Stewart Island further north. The wind's maximum velocity would have been 430 miles per hour. This is from the Lamont Dorothy Observatory. The increased pressure caused the kinetic energy of the comet would have caused a Coriolis effect on wind direction. The waves would have radiated outwards from the impact zone, knocking the eastern part of the fleet northeast to New Zealand and the western part of the fleet northwest to Australia. Diagram 4. The fate of each fleet is now discussed separately. So this is a really interesting page. Check it out. Gavin Menzies, www.gavinmenzies.net. I've heard this story before on documentaries, and it's documented in the Chinese historical reports about the ships and the fleets and the comet. So, is it possible that this comet, or some part of the comet caused some of these bold judgments? It's possible. Perhaps something astronomical went on. The sun was darkened. The people it's around the same time as the plagues. Maybe these bold judgments took their time. They mightn't have just happened in a space of a few months or a year. They might have taken many years to be released, if indeed they were at this time. It says the sixth angel poured out his bowl in the great river Euphrates, and the water was dried up to prepare the way for the kings of the east. Then I saw 3 impure spirits that looked like frogs. They came out of the mouth of the dragon, out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet. They are demonic spirits that perform signs, and they go out to the kings of the whole world to gather them to battle on that great day of Almighty God Almighty. Look, I come like a thief. Blessed is he who stays awake and remains clothed, so as not to go naked and be shamefully exposed. Then they gathered the kings together to the place in Hebrew called Armageddon. The seventh angel poured out his bowl into the air, and out of the temple came a loud voice from the throne saying, "It is done." Then there came flashes of lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder, a severe earthquake. No earthquake like it has ever occurred since mankind has been on earth. So tremendous was the quake. The great city split into 3 parts, and the cities of the nations collapsed. God remembered Babylon the Great and gave her the cup filled with the wine of fury of his wrath. Every island fled away, and the mountains could not be found. From the sky huge hailstones, each weighing about 100-pound, fell on people. And they cursed God on the account of the plague and hail, because the plague was so terrible. Now, can we prove that there was a battle in the valley of Megiddo? Okay, so the word for Armageddon in the Strongs is 717 Armageddon, a mountain of uncertain location. Of Hebrew origin, Ha and Megiddo. Now let's have a look what Megiddo means. A place in Manasseh. Origin word from Gadad. Definition, a place in Manasseh. Okay, so if we look at this, it's in the region of Manasseh, a mountain. Ha is hill, mountain, country. So mountain country in Manasseh. So 4023 Megiddo, it also says definition, a tower. And if we go down, it says Megiddo, Assyrian, Magadu, old Canaanitish city assigned to Manasseh, and the Strong's Exhaustive Concordance, Megiddon, says Megiddo from Gadad, rendezvous, Megiddon or Megiddo, a place in Palestine. So there's a place called Megiddo, but it also comes from this root word, a place to rendezvous, Gadad, 1413 Gadad, so, or Gordad, to penetrate or to cut, a primitive root word, to penetrate, cut, gash, muster yourself in troops, together, trooped. So does it mean mountain, where troops muster together? That would be the primitive root word origin, or it's a place that was assigned to Manasseh. So here's an ancient picture of Israel, where the tribes were located, the 12 tribes in Canaan. Manasseh is here, Megiddo. So here we have a topographical map of the region. It's in the Jezreel Valley. Megiddo is on this mountain range here near Haifa, Mount Carmel. However, if this region is Megiddo, it could have been in any of this mountainous area. So according to Samson Tours, this is regarding the Valley of Jezreel and the Battle of Megiddo. The list of battles fought at Megiddo. Approximately 34 battles have been fought in the Jezreel Valley, the Valley of Armageddon, at the base of Tel Megiddo. Napoleon Bonaparte declared it as the most natural battleground of the whole earth. Here are some of the most important ones. Tutmosis III versus the Canaanites in ca 1472 BCE. Deborah and Barks versus Sisera. Judges 5. Saul versus the Philistines. Solomon versus Pharaoh. Shishak in 2 Chronicles 12:3-4. Josiah versus Pharaoh Necho, not sure. 4 separate battles between Saladin and the Crusaders in the 12th century. Egyptian Mamluks versus the Mongols in the 14th century. Napoleon Bonaparte versus the Ottomans in the 1799. And General George Allenby versus Ottoman Turks in 1918. So there has been a lot of battles in this area, but let's just check out the Saladin Crusades battles and see what happens there. If the Battle of Armageddon hasn't happened yet, this puts us in a position of, are we before the destruction of the woman, or are we in the little season of Satan? I'm in a position of, I believe we're in the little season of Satan for other reasons. But that would mean that this history of the Battle of Armageddon has been hidden from us, and it's going to be very difficult to try and find evidence of it. Unless, of course, you take the translation of the word at its root meaning, which means a mountain where troops or armies gather together to battle. In the Crusader time, we have the Battle of Hattin, and I'll just read about that battle. Towards the middle of the 12th century, much of the Holy Land was in the hands of the European Christians. Beginning in 1095, the Catholic Church had sanctioned a number of religious expectations known as the Crusades. Efforts at capturing the Holy Lands in Christendom's most sacred city, Jerusalem. The only problem, as most are aware, Jerusalem bears a certain amount of religious significance in Islam and Judaism as well. As a result, the Crusaders were immensely unpopular in much of the Near Middle East, and Muslim armies were raised to stop the invading knights. By the 1160s, a new challenge had arisen, ready to take on the Pope's armies and evict the Crusaders from the region. His name was Saladin, and his victory and Battle of Hattin forever changed the balance of power in the near Middle East. Now, just going to stop there for a moment and go to Revelation. In Revelation 17, the angel tells John about the woman. It says, "The angel carried me away in spirit into the wilderness, where I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast and was covered with blasphemous names and had 7 heads and 10 horns. The woman was dressed in purple and scarlet and was glittering with gold, precious stones, and pearls. She held a golden cup in her hand filled with the abominable things and filth of her adulteries. The name written on her forehead was Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and the abomination of the earth." She's the mother of the prostituting churches or religious faiths. She's sitting on this beast that has 7 heads and 10 horns. It's a scarlet beast, like the dragon is scarlet, although the dragon has 7 crowns at that point, and this beast has no crowns. The beast of the sea has 10 crowns. What's interesting in Daniel is the little horn uproots 3 horns, and as I've explained in other videos, I believe that the little horn represents Herod and the Herod family, which later in Revelation gets described as the red dragon. So I'm wondering if those 3 crowns were joined with the other 7 horns later on in the reconstructed Roman Empire. And it says, "I saw the woman was drunk with the blood of God's holy people and the blood of those who bore testimony to Jesus." So although a lot of the people that bore testimony to Jesus died by the hands of Rome, it was the temple priests that really wanted them dead. If you put it in a modern context, it's like, for example, the dragon bankers of today who rule the military nations and get the military to do their bidding. So what's indicating to me that this woman is Jerusalem and the temple faith of Jerusalem, southern kingdom? Then the angel said to me, "The waters you saw were where the prostitute sits are the peoples, multitudes, nations, and languages. The beast and the 10 horns you saw will hate the prostitute, and they will bring her to ruin and leave her naked. They will eat her flesh and burn her with fire. For God has put it in their hearts to accomplish his purpose by agreeing to hand over to the beast their royal authority until God's words are fulfilled." So these 10 kings have a royal authority. "The woman you saw is the great city that rules over the kings of the earth." So I don't know if this means anything. It's just going off on a bit of a side tangent. But in Revelation 12, we've got the great red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns upon his head. So when we look at the word red for this Revelation 12 red, it's puros. And it means fiery red, fire colored. It says having the color of fire red. In Revelation 17, where we see the woman riding the scarlet beast, it has the name of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns, but no crowns. So it's the same as the dragon, fiery red beast, but it has no crowns. Now, if we look at the word scarlet, for this one, it's kokinos, scarlet, crimson, scarlet dyed with kermes, kokum, the female cocos of the kermes oak. So from the kernel shape of the insect, crimson coloured scarlet colour. Now, when we look at this scarlet colour, it says about scarlet yarn. It says, during the time of Moses, priests were instructed to dip scarlet yarn into the animal blood and use it to sprinkle and thus purify the ritually impure. Leviticus 14:6-7. But why scarlet yarn? So why not blue or purple like the yarns used to weave the curtains of the tabernacle? After all, blue and purple yarns were the most expensive yarns of the ancient world, symbolizing royalty and nobility. The scarlet yarn is a translation from the Hebrew, which literally means scarlet worm. So according to the Brown Driver Briggs Hebrew lexicon, the etymology of the word scarlet suggests the Coccolus illicits, a scale insect that attaches itself to oak trees native to the Western Mediterranean in order to feed. So what does this bug have to do with scarlet? When a female attaches itself to an oak and dies, its dried blood yields scarlet dye. Its death produces the means of purification, a process that undoubtedly foreshadows Christ, whose death on a tree poured forth the blood that cleanses us from our sins. So it says, while the symbolism is not made explicit in the intermediate Bible context, the use of scarlet yarn in Old Testament purification rites is noted by the author of Hebrews, who argues that the blood of the covenant was fulfilled by Christ with his own blood. So there's just a little bit of information that, so it may be the devil in the detail, because this scarlet coloured beetle comes from the Western Mediterranean, native to trees to the Western Mediterranean. So is it referring to this beast that this woman's riding as a Western Mediterranean beast? It's just an interesting thought and concept in the detail of the word etymology. Perhaps this is a reference to the concept that the dragon, because this beast looks exactly like the dragon, moved to the Western Mediterranean political and religious scene. So who rules over the kings of the earth? She's a prostitute to Babylon. She's not Babylon, but she's practicing Babylonian mystery religion. And Babylonian mystery religion comes from the Tower of Babel, from Nimrod, and all of the mystery religions sprang up from the region of the plains of Shinar, where Nimrod set up his Tower of Babel religious and political system. So the angel tells John, this calls for a mind with wisdom. 7 heads are 7 hills on which the woman sits. They are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other has not yet come. But when he does come, he must remain for only a little while. The beast who once was and now is not, is an 8th king. He belongs to the 7 and is going to his destruction. So is this a clue as to what time period we're in? Because I just want to go into Revelation 17 in the King James Version, because that was the NIV version, I believe. And in the King James Version, it says that the beast that thou sawest was, and is not, and yet shall ascend out of the bottomless pit and go into perdition. So perdition is apolia, destruction, loss, destruction, ruin, loss, perish, eternal ruin. In Revelation 20, when the dragon is cast into the bottomless pit and shut up for 1,000 years, until the 1,000 years should be fulfilled, and after that he must be loosed a little season. Once he's loosed, it says, when the 1,000 years are expired, Satan shall be loosed out of his prison and shall go to deceive the nations which are in the 4 quarters of the earth, Gog and Magog. And it said, and fire came down from God out of heaven and devoured them. The devil that deceived them was cast into the lake of fire, brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet, and shall be tormented day and night forever and ever. So in Revelation 17, this beast goes into perdition, a place of ruin. Is this referring to the dragon being bound for 1,000 years in a place of desolation and ruin? Perhaps Tartaria, as I've pointed out in some of my other videos, for 1,000 years. So if the beast that the woman's riding at the time is a Mediterranean beast, a Mediterranean dragon, it's ruling from the Western Mediterranean area. This is just a thought. Here the angel tells John that the 7 mountains, or the 7 kingdoms, is what a mountain is, on which the woman sits, and there are 7 kings. 5 are fallen, So 5 of these kingdoms have fallen. One is at the time that the angel's talking to John, so that has to be Rome. And the other is not yet come. And when he cometh, he must continue for a short space. So the beast itself that was and is not, even he is the 8th and is of the 7. So after the time of perdition, the 1,000 years, is there an 8th beast, an 8th dragon beast, that possibly we are living amongst this time now of the 8th? Now let's see if we can find those mountains or kingdoms that have fallen. We know that Pharaoh was referred to as a dragon. So we have this Mushusu, is a creature from ancient Mesopotamian mythology, a mythological hybrid. It is a scaly animal with hind legs resembling the talons of an eagle, lion, like 4 limbs, the long neck and tail and horn head of a snake, like tongue, and the crest, Mushusu, famously appears on the reconstructed Ishtar Gate of the city of Babylon, dating 6th century BCE. The form Mushusu is the Akkadian nominative of Sumerian Mushhush, reddish snake, sometimes also translated as fierce snake. One author, possibly following another's, translates it as splendid serpent. Mushusu already appears in Sumerian religion and art, as in the liberation vase of Gudea, dedicated to Ningishzida by the Sumerian ruler Gudea. Mushusu already appears in Sumerian, not to be confused with Cimmerian religion and art, as in the liberation vase of Gudea. Mushusu was the sacred animal of Marduk and his son Nabu during the Neo-Babylonian Empire. The dragon Mushusu from Marduk, once vanquished, became his symbolic animal and servant. It was taken over by Marduk from Tishpak, the local god of Eshnuna. So the constellation Hydra, there we go, that's from the Captain America movies, was known in Babylonian astronomical texts as Basmu, the serpent. It was depicted as having the torso of a fish, the tail of a snake, the 4 paws of a lion, the hind legs of an eagle, the wings and head comparable to the Mushusu. I don't know if anyone's seen the Disney film of Mulan, but there's this little dragon named Mushu, and this is just the secretive things they're doing and putting in kids' movies, getting them used to this Babylonian system that has, when we look into it, infiltrated everything for thousands of years. So in Ezekiel 29:3, it says, "Speak and say, Thus saith the Lord God, Behold, I am against thee, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, the great dragon that lieth in the midst of his rivers, which hath said, My river is mine own, and I have made it for myself." Isaiah 27:1, "In that day the Lord with his sword and great and strong sword shall punish Leviathan, the piercing serpent, even Leviathan, that crooked serpent, and he shall slay the dragon that is in the sea." Now remember, all the beasts of Daniel come up out of the sea. Now I've said that that could be in relation to the sea people of Japheth on the coast, and I think it is in the terms of the Roman Empire and people they were related to. However, coming up from the sea of all the beasts could also mean coming out of the flood. So that these beasts are all beasts that are coming up out of the sea. They're a system that is coming up after the flood, but the dragon is in the sea. So the dragon could also be related to the system that was being run before the flood, and the reason why the earth was destroyed by the flood, because of this dragon Babylonian style system, that it appears Nimrod reinstituted on the earth, and it has infiltrated every single system and worldview that we know of today. It's completely opposed to the system that God wanted, and The people of earth know nothing other than this Babylonian system. And when I say Herod is the dragon, it's because at this time in Revelation, he is depicting the dragon system over God's people. In Jeremiah 51:34, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, hath devoured me. He hath crushed me. He hath made me an empty vessel. He hath swallowed me up like a dragon. He hath filled his belly with my delicates. He hath cast me out. So the context of that verse is, the violence done to me and to my flesh be upon Babylon. Shall the inhabitant of Zion say, and my blood upon the inhabitants of Chaldea, shall Jerusalem say, therefore thus saith the Lord, behold, I will plead thy cause and take vengeance for thee, and I will dry up her sea and make her springs dry. And Babylon shall become heaps, a dwelling place for dragons, and astonishment and a hissing without an inhabitant. This is talking about what's being done to the kingdom of Judea. So I think that these 7 mountains or 7 kingdoms are obviously the part of the statue of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. We have Babylon, the kingdom of Media Persia, the kingdom of Greece. The legs of iron is the kingdom of Rome. So this is the kingdom that was at the time that the angel spoke to John. I think we can include Egypt into this, obviously going on these scriptures about Pharaoh being a dragon, Nebuchadnezzar, a dragon. So we have Egypt, 1, Babylon, 2, Assyria or Media, 3, Persia, 4, Greece, 5, Rome, 6 at the time of the angel. The new one to come, the kingdom of the restored Rome, 7. So at the time of the Crusades, we had the kingdom of restored Rome. So if we look at this woman riding this beast, we see that it's God's chosen people who have had this relationship with these empires all through the Bible. You know, Abraham comes out of Mesopotamia, and ever since that time we have Joseph going into Egypt, his family following him and becoming captives of Egypt and having to be led out by Moses. Again, God sending a prophet or a patriarch to rescue them. We have the Assyrian captivity. We have the Babylonian captivity. They stay in Babylon and are taken by the Medes and the Persians. The empire of Alexander's Greece rules Israel, or the southern kingdom of Israel. And then they're captive of the Romans. And we have this little horn who's ruling them, King Herod. And King Herod was a Roman client king of the Roman Empire, who's depicted as a dragon also. So we can see that these Babylonian system families, kingdoms, kings, pharaohs have been ruling God's people, and she's been whoring with them on and off, and every time she's redeemed by God, she goes back into mystery religion worship, sacrificing her children to Moloch and sacrificing the saints, sacrificing the prophets, sacrificing the patriarchs to these systems. So if we look at it that way, of all the places that have held God's people, Abraham's children, in captivity, we have Egypt, we have Babylon, we have Assyria, we have Persia, Greece, we have Rome, and then we have this Crusader state that goes into the Levant region, so it's called in Latin, and whatever remnant was left from the fall of Jerusalem, the converted Jews to Christianity, or they converted to Islam, or they're still Jews, they didn't convert at all. And it shows historically that they were still trying to rebuild the temple. At this point, there were still trying to get Rome to rebuild the temple for them. There were still synagogues and there were still Pharisees in the region trying to rebuild this third temple. So as we will see here, there's a failed attempt to rebuild the Jewish temple. Julian in 362 promulgated an edict to guarantee freedom of religion, and he traveled to the Holy Land and Jerusalem in 363. Julian stopped by the ruins of the second temple in Jerusalem on his way to Persia. The Jewish temple had been destroyed by Roman legions under Titus in 70 AD and had laid in ruins ever since. However, it says going back to St. Matthew, there's quite a famous Bible commentary from 1859 called Haydock Bible Commentary, commenting on the verse from the Gospel according to St. Matthew. There is found a historical account from 363 AD when Julian, together with the Jews, tried to rebuild the temple, going against what Jesus said in the Gospel of Matthew. According to the account, a remarkable event took place. The account is transcribed below. Haydock Bible Commentary on St. Matthew chapter 24 verse 2. Julian the Apostate, wishing to falsify the predictions of Daniel and Jesus Christ, attempted to rebuild the temple. For this purpose he assembled the chief among the Jews and asked them why they neglected the prescribed sacrifices, and was answered that they could not offer anywhere else but in the temple of Jerusalem. Upon this he ordered them to return to Jerusalem to rebuild their temple and restore their ancient worship, promising them that his concurrence in carrying on the work. This filled the Jews with inaccessible joy. Hence, flocking to Jerusalem, they began with scorn and triumph to insult over the Christians. Contributions came in from all parts. The Jewish women stripped themselves of their most costly ornaments. The emperor opened his treasury to furnish everything necessary for the building. The most able workmen were convened from all parts. Persons of the greatest distinction were appointed to direct the work, and the emperor's friend Alypius was set over the whole with orders to carry on the work without ceasing and to spare no expense. All materials were laid in to an immense quality. The Jews of both sexes bore a share in the labor, the women helping to dig the ground and carry away the rubbish in their aprons and gowns. It is even said that the Jews appointed some pickaxes, spades, and baskets to be made of silver for the honor of the work. Till this time the foundations and some ruins of the walls had remained, as appears from St. Cyril in the Catechism 15 and Eusebius 406. These ruins of the Jews first demolished with their own hands, thus concurring to the accomplishment of our Saviour's prediction. They next began to dig new foundations, in which many thousands were employed. But what they had thrown up in the day was by repeated earthquakes, the night following cast back again into the trench. When Alypius next day was earnestly pressing on the work, with assistance of the governor of the province, there issued, says Ammianus Marcellinus, such horrible balls of fire out of the earth near the foundations as to render the place inaccessible from time to time to the scorched workmen. And the victorious element, continuing in this manner, obstinately bent, as it were, to drive them to a distance. Alypius thought proper to abandon, though reluctantly, the enterprise. This great event happened in the beginning of the year 363, and with many very astonishing circumstances is recorded both by Jews and Christians. See the proof and much fuller account of this astonishing event, which all the ancient fathers describe as indubitable, in Alban Butler's Life of St. Cyril of Jerusalem, March 18th. Thus they so completely destroyed whatever remained of the ancient temple that there was not left one stone upon another, nor were they permitted by heaven ever to begin the new one. This is from Maldonatus. So it says, not everyone is willing to accept an explanation of divine intervention. The failure to rebuild the temple has by some been ascribed to an earthquake. So here we've got proof. Here's proof of an earthquake. And that there was great earthquake activity in this region at this time. Common in the region and to the Jews, ambivalence about the project. Sabotage has also been proposed as a possibility. How could it be sabotage? It had to be, if all their work in the morning was undone, they would have had to have crews working overnight, and people would have seen that. As well as accidental fire, still divine intervention has been the common view among Christian historians of the time and even after. So Julian did live to hear about the disastrous events in Jerusalem, though it was one of the last things he experienced in his life. Libanius states that Julian was assassinated shortly after by a Christian who was of his own soldiers, though this charge is not held by Ammianus Marcellinus or other contemporary historians. Julian was succeeded by the short-lived emperor Jovian, who ruled until 364. So let me ask, why does Julian want to rebuild the Jewish temple? Why would a Roman emperor want to go against God? This is after the time of Constantine. If he was a pagan, he wouldn't care about the Jewish temple. If he was a Christian, he wouldn't care about the Jewish temple. He wouldn't want to dishonor the words of Jesus. So why does Julian want to rebuild this temple? And the only answer is if he was a Herod or he was in a alliance with the Pharisees of the temple priests. So in his last words, there are reports that Julian's dying words were, Vicisti Galilee, you have one Galilean. What does that mean? You have one Jesus? This is considered to be from an apocryphal source and is presumed to express his recognition that with his death, Christianity would become the emperor's state religion. Julian's anti-Christian measures did not survive, nor did they have much effect on slowing down the rapid spread of the Christian religion throughout the Roman Empire and beyond. Julian's own Hellenist high priest urged pagans to imitate Christian charity. Seeing how it was a most effective strategy to recruit new followers and spread its influence into people's hearts and culture. To the Romans, it was obviously Christian charity that won the support and gratitude of the people. So here it is in these words that we can see a turnaround in the philosophy of these people, that to kill Christians and to martyr them was not a good tactic, and that instead it was a better tactic to emulate them and to infiltrate them. Whether you believe in Haycock's account where the failed attempt to rebuild the Jewish temple was attributed to divine intervention, or whether you remain skeptical to all of it, is up to you. What cannot be ignored, however, is that through this event, Christ's prediction came true in a very literal way. Despite emperor's attempt to rebuild, his decree to do this led the Jews to demolish the last walls of the construction with the intention of rebuilding it. This caused the last remaining part of the temple ruins to be completely destroyed, not even a stone upon a stone. It is another example of how fascinating history can be. So, here we have an account to rebuild the temple in 363, a Roman emperor who was the main driving force behind it. So clearly he had some personal investment in this. And it just shows that through all this time, the main goal has been to rebuild this temple in this area and to re-establish not only building a temple, but the temple system of the priesthood and the trading route of the Silk Road and the power of the trading route and the financial dominance that this region had over world trade. And you've got to ask yourself, if Julian was on his way to Persia, he would have seen the benefits of this trading city that was in between Rome and Persia, or Constantinople and Persia. And we have this final occupation by this final beast that by the end they are murdered, slaughtered, and the blood runs up to the horses' bridles. And I believe this is the judgment of God's great winepress. I think this is the seventh head, restored Rome, including the Kingdom of Jerusalem. It's definitely the seventh head of the beast. But in saying that, let's not get confused that there's the beast of the sea, which is a different beast. It has the leopard, bear, and lion imagery. The beast of the woman's riding appears to be the dragon. It's all the same imagery as the dragon, yet it doesn't have the crowns. So the beast of the sea, the seventh head, is the one that's wounded and miraculously repaired. And the seventh head of the dragon the woman is riding is the seventh or last empire of the beast, but the whole beast is the eighth, which comes after the perdition. And then we have this time of perdition. So this dragon is cast into perdition, or a place where it loses its power. So wherever this dragon goes that's ruling from the Mediterranean Western Roman kingdom, at this point it goes to somewhere where it is unable to gain its power or have power. And we see at this time, which I'll go into later, the fall of the Silk Road, the fall of the merchants of the Silk Road, never to be revived again. And I believe that today we are in the eighth beast, because there are seven heads, but even the beast itself is an eighth of the seven. And I think that it's an eighth because it has been unchained and allowed out of perdition, and it's been given its little season to rule. So the first captivity of Abraham's children was when Jacob's son Joseph goes into Egypt, and during the famine, the whole family ends up in Egypt. They later are made slaves of Egypt, and it takes Moses with the power of God to free them from captivity. The next captivity was of the Northern Kingdom, the 10 tribes, which I think are related to the 10 horns, the 10 crowns, was of Assyria. We have the next captivity, which was the Babylonian captivity. So after Babylon was conquered by the Medes and the Persians, we have a Persian captivity until Cyrus the Great allows the southern kingdom of Judah to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. Then there's the Greek or Seleucid occupation of Jerusalem and the Jews of this region. Also the lost 10 tribes would have been amongst some of these regions over here in Asia Minor and Media. And finally, we have the sixth head of the beast, the Roman Empire, who conquered the Greek Empire of the Middle East and took over its control, therefore controlling the area of Palestine and Judea. Finally, we have this Crusader occupation of this same area, which is the seventh head of the beast, I believe. And then what happens is that they are conquered by Saladin and the Ottoman Turks, and the area lies in control of the Ottoman Turks for apparently right up until the First World War. And I think this is the time that the little season was started, because at this time the dragon bankers have gained power back to take back this region of land. We know that through the Crusader states that the banking elite of Rome was working through the church to gain control of this area. They were unable to gain control of the Ottoman Empire, obviously. Not that they didn't have anything to do with its inception, but there were probably too many warring factions within the Ottoman Empire that didn't allow them to, number one, control Jerusalem, and number two, control the trade of the Silk Road. Also at this time, the Khazars had a lot of trouble with the Mongol hordes, the kings of the east, who pushed them out of their lands. And they were cast into perdition, where they lost their power to rule or to gain back this temple area. And I think that the whole inception of the modern state of Israel is in fact the 8th beast, dragon, and that since its inception we have been in its little season